a time when the continent is trying to contend with the trifactor that includes the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and the effects on climate change. These have exacerbated conditions across the African continent that have implications for both debt and development. A lot has already been said by esteemed speakers before me, so I'm going to focus on just 3 issues. The first issue I'd like to mention is just the fact that debt in Africa's development context is not an option. It is a reality of Africa's development trajectory. And so the important thing there is to ensure 2 things. First, that we democratize the management of Africa's debt, i.e., get civil society and the population as a whole more interested and involved in monitoring and contributing to the discourse around what is contracted, at what cost, and for which purpose. I think these are 3 important questions that really need to be tackled. Most estimates suggest that Africa is going to need over $420 billion to recover from the effects of both the pandemic and the wars, and get back on track to attain the Sustainable Development Goals. This is why UNDP's strategic offer in Africa identifies development financing as one of 3 cross-cutting enablers that will put the continent back on track. And so since we all agree that debt is not an option, we have to make sure that we are not just agreed, but we are involved in what it is used for and what it's going to cost the country over the long term. So that's my first point. My second point is the evolving nature of Africa's debt. About a number of speakers have mentioned the HIPC debt relief initiative of the late 90s and early 2000s. At that time, the preponderance of Africa's debt was owed to multilateral organizations. And so restructuring was complex, but pretty much doable. Today, private debt, Euro bonds account for an increasing amount, and multilateral debt is waning. A number of bilateral development partners who in the past used to give African countries grants are now extending loans. And so the nature of debt has changed. Also, in 2010, domestic government debt in Africa was 15%, 15% of GDP. Today, it's over 30%. It has doubled as a proportion of GDP. We've talked extensively about the impact of external debt, but the growing cancer in Africa's in the management of Africa's fiscal affairs, and particularly when it comes to the issue of debt stress, is increasingly becoming domestic debt. And so we have to, as a continent, ask very important questions. Yes, it's very, it is true that a lot of external debt has been predatory, odious, and unfair, but it's also true that domestic debt is mounting, and the fiscal impacts are a lot more direct. And so we have to switch from viewing Africa's debt issues from just a problem lens that is mainly externally driven to an opportunity lens, articulating exactly what we need to do to change the narrative and to ensure that we are moving the continent in a different direction when it comes to the strategic investments needed for development. Those investments include in infrastructure, in technology, in skills and also in human capacity. So how we address this is really important, but we have to be able to look at the changing and evolving nature of debt. So we don't default to the mistakes of the past and have one strategy for all African countries, but we are taking a really, really close analytical approach to understand where the debt is mounting and how best to ensure that both external and domestic debt are not just reimagined and restructured, but are repurposed away from consumption to investment. My third point is that Africa's immense natural resources must finance a greater proportion of Africa's development. The reason why, when we look at numbers like the 425 billion required for Africa to recover from the current exogenous shocks, we're thinking about where are we going to get this money and how is the international community going to develop Africa? I'm forgetting that the judicious management of natural resources will put African countries in a much better place to finance most of its investment requirements and rely a lot less on debt. This means de-risking investment in Africa. This means leveraging public-private partnerships, and also means ensuring that financial institutions in Africa actually intermediate. They don't just exist to buy treasury bills and roll them over, but they look at the amount of capital, assets under management in Africa's insurance companies, commercial banks, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and see how these could be leveraged not just to attract more investment, but also to actively de-risk. And so these 3 points, I believe, should help us move away from not just the rhetoric to the practicalities of how debt conversations become empowering for development. Because the issue is not so much which economic philosophy you believe in. The issue becomes how we ensure that every African citizen has a fighting chance and that we are not disadvantaging future generations by needless quantums of both domestic and external debt.